white supremacists should be afraid to show their face in public. They shouldn't be so out and proud that they're throwing banners over the highway. And part of that is just kind of finding solidarity with each other and putting our foot down and saying that it's not who we are and that those people should be ashamed.
Good evening. So tonight we are tackling challenges to safeguarding our democracy, which is part of our 6-week spring series, Governing in Crisis, Biden and the Looming Midterms, presented by the Suffolk University Political Science and Legal Studies Department in collaboration with Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, the Washington Center, and GBH's Forum Network. In addition to recognizing this evening's sponsors, I'd like to thank the Lowell Institute, whose generous funding makes programs like this possible. This program is being recorded by GBH's Forum Network and will be published on their website. We'll share the links to those pages with you in the chat. In this evening's episode, our distinguished panel will examine the impact of partisan rancor, not seen since the Civil War, declining trust in institutions, doubts about our election process, and the insurrection that took place at our United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. But also, they'll explore solutions to restoring faith in our country's institutions. This is an especially timely conversation, and we are so pleased that you have joined us this evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Christina Kulich, who is a faculty member in Suffolk University's Political Science and Legal Studies Department. Christina?
Thank you, Susan, and welcome to everyone in the audience. Welcome back, students and wider public. This is a really fabulous panel, and I'm very, very excited to get it started. But as is my professional hazard, I'm going to keep you for a few minutes in order to frame the class. So the topic tonight is really about the question of the health of American democracy. And there have been plenty of recent commentaries that sound alarms and gloom and doom, and some of these are merited and some of these perhaps not. I will admit I am a glass is half empty girl, but I also study democratic erosion. So the United States definitely is facing some problems, but we are not alone. Democracy as a regime type globally is in trouble. Democracies in terms of how political scientists would talk about them, at least in terms of measurable things that must be present for us to be able to call a system a democracy, have been in decline for the past 15 years. So in this past cycle, 25 of the only 41 established democracies in the globe suffered overall declines. And the United States was certainly among them, suffering an 11-point decline, at least as measured by Freedom House. Now, my political scientist colleagues will argue about the utility of using Freedom House, but it is an index like others. So if we can go to the next slide, you can see a little bit about what the decline in America's ranking in terms of democracies in the world looks like. Right, an 11-point decline, which is pretty precipitous. And according to Freedom House, there are 3 main reasons that our ranking has declined. So the next slide, those 3 largest items are unequal treatment of people of color, partisan polarization, and the improper influence of money in politics. Now, they have some suggested solutions to that, but I'm going to leave it to the panel to be able to talk about those things themselves. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel. First of all, we have U.S. Representative James Clyburn of South Carolina. We have Gilda Daniels, who is a lawyer and a professor at the University of Baltimore. Laura Gamboa, who is a professor of politics at Utah State University. If I got that wrong, Laura, you can correct me. Jared Holt, who is a fellow with the Atlantic Council. And Aaron Schachter will be our moderator tonight. And Aaron, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'm very excited to start this off. Thank you to all the panelists for joining us this evening for this incredibly important conversation about doom and gloom, if you're the glass half empty kind of person. I'd like to start it off with just a few words from each of you, 2 to 3 minutes, with your general thoughts on this topic, and then we will move into questions. Congressman Clyburn, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you very much. You know, I'm a glass half full kind of person. Let me start out saying that. In fact, it's been pretty widely reported that 3 or 4 weeks ago at one of our caucus meetings, the Democratic caucus in the Congress, I used a glass half full of water to make my point over why we see our numbers being what they are. If we spend all of our time talking about what we have not done and don't share with people what we have done and what we can build upon going forward, then we'll always be arguing over what needs to be done. So I come to Congress over 30 years ago, having spent a lot of time in state government, but I started out this trek at 12 years old, being elected president of my NAACP Youth Council, organizing sit-ins at 19. John Lewis and I met as 19-year-old college students. The same weekend I met Martin Luther King Jr., and I've been involved in this ever since. Now, as gloomy as things are, I remember the 1961 Freedom Rides. I remember sitting in jail a lot of times, wondering whether or not we were doing the right thing. And so I don't think any of that, though, measures what we're doing today, what's going on around us. And I'm reminded of what George Santayana wrote: if we fail to learn the lessons of history, we're bound to repeat them. Mm. And we are repeating some history. It was 1872. A lot of people talk about Pleasant versus Ferguson, 1896, but the first Supreme Court decision that started us on that route came in 1872. A Kulich-Vamyakas decision, which is what ushered in Jim Crow. And it all got culminated in 1896. You've seen some recent Supreme Court decisions, Shelby v. Holder, and now the Supreme Court made a decision last week that in Selma, Alabama, although the 3-judge panel decided that what they did was unfair to people of color, the Supreme Court said, yes, it may be unfair, but we're going to allow the election to go anyway. So it seems to me that we are repeating some history here, and I hope that tonight's discussion will shed some light on what we can do to avoid what happened after the 1876 Kulich-Vamyakas decision, 1872 Kulich-Vamyakas decision.
Thank you, sir. I'm just going to go in the order that's on my screen here. I'm not putting anyone above anyone else. Laura, you're next.
Thank you very much for having me here. I am also a half full glass kind of person. I do think, however, that in the United States, the situation is problematic, right? In order to be counted as a democracy, a country needs to have what we political scientists call an even playing field. That is, elections should be fought in a place in which we all play by somehow the same rules, right? And in this country, that is changing dramatically for the worse, right? This country did not have a full democracy until the 1960s, half 1960s. And since then, things were improving a little bit. And now it seems like Representative, like the congressman said, we're just moving backwards. What we're seeing right now is a systematic manipulation of electoral laws at the subnational level in order to make sure that certain groups do not attain power. That's pretty much what it is. And some of these changes are quite drastic. We're talking about cooptation of electoral authorities. We're talking about rules that effectively ban certain people from voting. And if we were seeing any of these changes in any other country of the world, we would be up in arms about it. And we would be calling them on it. This is how Venezuela lost its democracy. Venezuela lost its democracy the minute the government started to co-opt electoral institutions, and they started to change the rules in a way that just make it really, really hard to defeat the incumbent. Really, really almost impossible to defeat the incumbent. And what we're seeing is that this is happening, especially in states where elections are particularly competitive. And I think that that is concerning, though not necessarily irreversible.
That was an interesting conversation after being glass half full. Jared, you're next.
Yeah, I, to be honest, am a glass half empty type of person, but I try to be a glass half full person as much as I can. Otherwise, I might go crazy. What I'm seeing in my research into domestic extremist movements has been particularly concerning over the last year, particularly after the January 6th Capitol riot. A lot of the sentiments, even some of the same groups and figures responsible for provocating the conspiracy theories and lies and misinformation that produced the Capitol riot have since encouraged the people who believe what they tell them to take their efforts down to a local level. So pursuing positions in city councils, in school boards. Some of the more alarming ones that I've seen are pursuing Secretary of State positions, which would enable them to oversee elections. And participating in the democratic process is everybody's right. It is a function of democracy. But a lot of these individuals have expressed a intention to try to obtain these offices to pursue anti-democratic goals that are exclusionary rather than inclusionary, and often the type of policies and changes they want to make would impact some of the most vulnerable communities in this country. So I definitely think there is cause for alarm in that respect. Additionally, some of the rhetoric and conspiracy theorizing, a good example of this is the effort to rewrite the history of what happened on January 6th, has worked its way from conspiracy blogs and influencers, unfortunately, up to some members of Congress and major media influencers. So to have that kind of coming into, continuing to claw towards the mainstream spotlight, while you also have this activity happening on a local level, often in quieter settings or places that don't have really great local news coverage, well-funded news coverage to dig it up and expose it and bring attention to it, puts it in a situation where I think that it requires us to be more active participants in this democracy. There are more of us than there are of them. There are more people fighting for this vision of multiracial democracy in the US than those who wish to upend it. But if we, for lack of a better term, sit around and lollygag, democracy is not a given. And if you don't fight for it, you might just lose it.
Okay, thank you. Professor Daniels.
Thank you. I have been working in this area of voting rights for more than 2 decades. I am a former deputy chief in the Civil Rights Division voting section at the Department of Justice, and I'm a law professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and I continue to work with organizations in fighting against certainly these suppressive laws that we will discuss tonight. I'm the author of a book on it, Uncounted: The Crisis of Voter Suppression in America. And I think one of the things that's very important to point out from the outset is that this is not new, as Representative Clyburn pointed out in looking at our history as a country, right? We have had periods where you've had periods of great progress. We certainly look to Reconstruction, where some historians say that was the first time that we saw a multiracial democracy. During the Reconstruction period, and in that period, we saw newly enfranchised, formerly enslaved Black men register and vote and elect more than 2,000 people to local, state, and federal offices, and had in the state of Mississippi elected 2 African Americans to the United States Senate during a very short period of time. And we're in 2022 is only the second time where we actually had 2 African American men from the South in the United States Senate. We only have 3 African Americans in the United States Senate today. And so we have this period of Reconstruction that we can look to see where you actually have the opportunity to see what a multicultural democracy would look like. But you also have the period of redemption, certainly where white supremacists and white nationalists said, certainly as a subtitle of my book, "Forget last, not so fast." During that period where they passed restrictive and suppressive laws that brought in things such as poll taxes and literacy tests and the grandfather clauses, that essentially wiped the slate clean and wiped the voter registration rolls clean, where in places like Alabama, where there were more than 100,000 Black men who were registered to vote, after the passage of laws such as literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses, that number went from more than 100,000 to 46 individuals. And so we're seeing today, certainly the passage of these restrictive state legislation that certainly has the same effect in many results, that it is in many regards going to make it has made it harder for people of color and young people and elderly people and others to register and vote and participate in the democratic process. And we certainly saw the level of progress in 2020, where we had more than 60% of eligible persons to participate in the electoral process. And then that was met with these laws that is certainly meant to, in large part, eliminate that, right? To restrict who can actually access the right to vote. And so it is, whether it's glass half full or glass half empty, I'm a glass half full person, knowing that this is something that we've seen before. And I think that we need to recognize that at this time in our history, we have more tools. And I think, and as Jared said, so we have more people, right, who are ready and committed to do the work of maintaining a democracy, because it, by all means, does take work.
Thank you for that, Professor Daniel. Since we ended with you, I just wonder, what are the tactics now of voter suppression? We certainly hear lots of stories from different states about things going on. How is the vote being suppressed?
Well, I wrote a whole book on this, Aaron, so I only have 2 minutes for this, but certainly some of the ways that we are seeing seeing access to the ballot box being restricted, and certainly that voters are being suppressed, is certainly with restrictive voter ID. And I get the question all the time, but we need IDs. You need an ID for to go to the movies and to do these other things. And when we say restrictive voter ID, we're talking about states where they require only 2 or 3 types of identification as the types of acceptable identification for actually accessing the right to vote. Certainly in the 50s and 1960s, the restrictions were on registration. They wouldn't allow folk to register unless they could tell you how many bubbles were in a bar of soap or how many beans were in a jar, right, through literacy tests. So now certainly the Voting Rights Act helped to eliminate those kinds of restrictions on voter registration. So now we're seeing our restrictions on access and suppressing access. And so things such as restricted voter ID, and voter challenges, voter purges that are inaccurate, felon disenfranchisement, which is something that certainly came about post-Reconstruction in the way that we're seeing it today. And for example, in places like, well, certainly nationally, we have about 5 million people who, because they were previously convicted of a felony, cannot cast ballots in states across the country, and places like Florida, where you had ballot initiatives that said we should allow, in this instance, more than 800,000 people to get their right to vote restored. You had a legislature and a governor who said, "Free at last, not so fast." Now you cannot participate unless you pay your fines, fees, and restitution. So certainly where you see instances where you saw a loosening and expanding of the opportunity to cast a ballot, as we saw in 2020 with the expansion of early voting, and the expansion of drop boxes and other means for people to actually access the right to vote. You certainly saw that very quickly dissipate with the passage of these state legislative laws that make it harder and eliminate a number of those means that were being used, particularly by people of color and other voters.
Well, that was a great 2 minutes. We should still buy your book, though, right? There's much
Absolutely.
more. Okay, good.
Absolutely.
We have a section later on where viewers ask questions, but I think probably many of you are much smarter than I am, and you've got great questions already being sent in. And this one is from Linda Sanders. How can democracy survive in an age of willful misinformation and alternate facts? I think that is the big question of the moment, right? If one group of people believes not a thing that the other group of people believes, how do we move forward as a society? Representative Clyburn?
Well, that's such a philosophical question. Maybe one of the professors ought to deal with that. I tend to feel that you can't. That's part of the whole design, is to build distrust in the media. We've heard it throughout the last administration, referring to the press as the enemy of the people. We have lessons of the 1930s in Germany and Italy as to how all of this is done. And we see it being done right here in these United States. And we tend to pretend that it's not happening. I warned way back, just my studies of this, and I saw what was happening in this administration. And the night before his first address, 45's first address to the general or joint session, I said on CNN that this man is not planning to give up the office. And I was asked that night by Don Lemon, "Are you calling this man Hitler?" I said, "No, he's Mussolini. Putin is Hitler." And now every time I turn around, people are referring to something as Mussolini. The history is clear. It's clear. Either you read it and adhere to it, or you dismiss it and ignore it. And we seem to be ignoring all of these warning signs all around us. So the answer to the question is, if that is going to prevail, we're not going to survive. And then if you look back, you're going to see we started out this experiment with a strong central government. That's what was going on with Reconstruction. And we decided that we would throw this stuff down to the states and let them make the determination. If you remember, Ms. Daniels, Mississippi did send 2 United States senators up. They didn't elect them, though. Those United States senators were sent up. We didn't have a general election of senators in what, 1913, I think, with the 17th Amendment. And so now, all of a sudden, we decided that we're going to send it back down to the states. And that's what's going on now in Georgia. Nullification laws. Arizona just proposed that the state legislature will be empowered to overturn an election if they don't like the outcome. You can't let that stand. Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution is pretty clear, but we shouldn't be ignoring it. The Federalist Papers 59, Alexander Hamilton made it very clear that this is not supposed to be happening, but it is happening, and we're ignoring the Constitution, we're ignoring the Federalist Papers. You can't survive if you're going to ignore it and pretend it's not happening.
Well, Professor Gamboa, you have you study a situation much more recent than the Second World War. What are the parallels you see, and how do we get ourselves out of them?
So in terms of misinformation, I think that misinformation is not new. It's just, it has become mainstream, which is what Jared was saying, right? Like it's not like we don't need to go as far as Germany or Italy. We can go as far as Venezuela in the 1990s, early 2000s. We can go to Nicaragua in the 2000s, and I can give you like Argentina in the 70s to know that there is misinformation is everywhere. Is people's willingness to believe it that has changed, right? And this is significantly mediated by polarization, right? Our we are so divided that we are unwilling to believe facts that do not confirm our own preconceptions of the world, right? And this, of course, is a super fertile ground for fake news and for misinformation and radical groups. I think in terms of how do we fix this, I think there's a couple of things that are very important. I think we need leadership. And I mean leadership in the sense that we need people who are willing to endorse democracy, regardless of policy implications. That is, people who are willing to stand with our institutions. And by institutions, I not only mean the court, I also mean Congress and the politicians that are in Congress and who are standing behind the due process and are standing behind the appropriate way by which we collectively govern ourselves. I think we need to work towards decreasing polarization. There's tons of grassroots organizations trying to create and teach people how to have conversations with people who disagree with them, right? Which is very easy, very complicated. And I think ultimately what we need is a more broad participation. I think Jared is also right. I think, so what we know and from sort of Twitter analysis and so on and so forth is that fake news do not spread. Fake news are repeated and sort of shared by a very small amount of people, but these people are just very loud. And because they're very loud, they kind of drown everybody else. And so we need to show up. We need to show up. We, and by we mean the people who have not traditionally shown up. The system is not going to fix itself. It's not going to protect, like, I tell my students all the time, Venezuela was the most stable democracy in Latin America. It was rich, it had strong institutions, it had a two-party system, like nothing could break Venezuela's democracy, and here we are, right? Mm-hmm. And so democracy just doesn't survive by itself. It needs somebody to defend it beyond like policy implications. That would be my take.
Well, you talk there about the media, and Jared, this is a question from Samantha Jane Walsh. You mentioned on CNN that the right-wing political content exists in what you called a parallel media universe. Do you think this is a sign of how much more politically polarized the country has become? And is there a way for people to come together if we're living in parallel universes?
Yeah, when I said that on CNN, what I was getting at is there's kind of a notion, it's starting to go out of fashion, thankfully, that, by simply saying aha with a fact check or something, that people will be dissuaded of misinformation. And what I was really getting at there is that online, especially, the people who become avid consumers of misinformation, ranking from people who may just come across things with hyper partisan spin, whether it's left wing or right wing, or people who, dive deep into conspiracy theories like QAnon. A lot of the time, the way these platforms are designed and the way that these media outlets posture themselves really discourages engaging with any information outside of the pre-existing confines of that sort of online network of influencers, media outlets, activists, etc. And what it's kind of produced over time, I think, is a bit of a feedback loop where these outlets and influencers, as Dr. Gamboa said, the loud voices in the room, are producing, stoking further polarization. And then the audiences are becoming more polarized, which is creating more demand for polarized content. And it's going back and forth and really sort of driving to the extremes of the spectrum here. So as far as disrupting it goes, I do think, I am not a de-radicalization effort, and the question of what we do about it to sort of disrupt that loop that's going is among the existential questions of the field of research that I work in. So I don't have a silver bullet answer, but I do think what usually tends to be effective is appealing, getting good information, getting good sources of content, and encouraging productive conversations rather than polarized and divisive ones. Still can take place pretty effectively on especially local levels, institutions like the church, institutions like community organizing groups, because as the decline in trust on national media has gone down, trust in local media has been more or less about the same throughout that same time period. It has declined with the trend, but not at the same rate. So I think it could be, a worthwhile effort to explore the idea of getting that really good information and taking it into these venues that people trust already, and speaking as a community instead of a top-down approach. Give it to the grassroots, if you will, and let them make sense of it.
If you're not going to have a silver bullet approach, you're not going to do very well on the cable news. So we need black and white in the media. Come on, this gray stuff is just not okay. We have some Suffolk University students waiting in the wings to ask questions. I just want to ask one more question. We have I lost who it is who asked this question, but somebody wanted to know, Professor Daniels, what can folks here in Massachusetts do? This is the bluish purple state. What can we do to affect change in these other places where these laws are being enacted?
Well, I tell folks to do a few things, and I think this is where, regardless of where you are, but certainly educate yourselves about the process, right? The process of registration, as well as the process to vote, in regards to as well. And then it's also, I tell people to educate, legislate, litigate, participate, right? And so educate yourselves about the process, be aware of legislation that's going forward, even in Massachusetts and other parts of the country, and how it impacts the right to vote. Be aware of legislation certainly that's happening in Congress, and contacting your elected officials and so we can have a more representative democracy and make sure that they're certainly representing your positions. And then there are organizations that are litigating these issues, like Advancement Project National Office, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, ACLU, DEMOS, Latino Justice. I could have a whole list of them if you like, but certainly working with those organizations and contributing to those organizations, and then participating. I think it's important that folk sign up to be poll workers, and certainly working with organizations like Election Protection on Election Day to make sure that you can help people who are having problems in accessing the right to vote, and certainly working with organizations that help people get the proper ID, or that helps to turn out people to the polls, are all things that people can do to make sure that we're all using certainly what I call our people power to try to effectuate change.
Okay, thank you. So we have students now from Suffolk University who are here with us to ask a few questions. They have now turned their cameras on. Welcome to the students. We will start with Hafsa Khatib. You have a question.
Hello, my name is Hafsa Khatib. I'm a second-year student at Suffolk University, studying law and legal studies. I'd like to thank Professor Kulich for this opportunity, and thank you, Erin, for introducing me. My question is towards Jared Holt. A recent article published by The Guardian highlighted a study reporting that 1 in 5 applicants to the white supremacist group Patriot Front claim to hold current or former ties to the U.S. military. According to the leaked documents published and reviewed by the Southern Poverty Law Center and alternative media collective Unicorn Riot, the Pentagon itself has acknowledged this problem. I'm curious about this phenomenon. Why is it happening? Is it coincidental? And how worried should we be? What does your research tell you about this?
Yeah, so what you're talking about, a group called Patriot Front, who has made headlines for appearing at events like March for Life in both DC and Chicago, and doing kind of flash demonstrations in DC and various places across the US. It's a neo-fascist organization in no uncertain terms. That's how they describe themselves. And recently, all of their information was leaked out into the public, published by Unicorn Riot, that nonprofit independent collective. Silly name, but great work. And, you know, what the SPLC found there about so many applicants to the group claiming military background is not really unlike a whole lot of other extremist groups we've seen. Oftentimes extremist groups, particularly white supremacist ones, militia movement ones, will go out of their way to try to seek applicants or recruits from law enforcement and military backgrounds. And in their minds, this does a couple things. One, it brings people into the organization who have formal training in applying violence to situations. And perhaps more importantly, in the short term for them, is it brings an air of respectability to it. It is not, just a whole bunch of random people that met on a forum board and came together, but look, there's former cops and there's former military. This is a noble thing. So this is an important question, an important thing to talk about in respect to extremism in the US, because like it or not, any type of solution to combating some of the most violent products of violent extremism in the US is going to involve law enforcement in one form or another. And if law enforcement is turning a blind eye or unaware, or members are participating in these kind of groups, that undermines the trust of law enforcement to get those kind of jobs done. And it also undermines the faith of law enforcement more generally, which contributes to more uneasiness and more skepticism, which can then be twisted and exploited to further polarize and further isolate people from the communities that if they participated in, could really affect change.
Okay, next on my list here is Comfort Cooper.
Hello, thank you, Erin, and thank you, panelists, for speaking to us on such an important issue. My question is for Professor Laura Gamboa. Professor, it seems clear to me that there is a fight between both political parties where they can't agree on basic facts and policies. And this has really put a huge strain on our democracy, as well as a lack of trust. But President Biden has promised to restore the American people's faith in our democracy. But the question here is really like, has he done so? Has he really done anything to restore the people's faith? And how can our country really improve national governance before our system fails?
Oh, that's not a softball. So to answer the first question, I think he has tried, right? He has certainly tried to introduce legislation that helps protect democracy and strengthen institutions. He had tried to introduce policy changes that are somehow bipartisan, so that we can start like thinking about government as a bipartisan thing in which agreements can actually be made. But there's so much that a president can do, right? And I think there's the particular the way Congress is set up, and the way in particular Congress is set up, it's just with the current polarization levels, it's just really hard to work with. I think as a president and as a leader, he has certainly changed the tone of the conversation, right? He has toned down the rhetoric. He has tried to reach across the aisle. He has not condoned authoritarian regimes inside or outside the country, which we saw President Donald Trump do repeatedly. He has encouraged democracy. He has, so I think discursively he has tried. I think in Congress he has tried. I don't think he has always been successful, and sort of the failure of the recent voting legislation to protect voting is show of that. But I think it just kind of gets out of his hands. In terms of governance, this is kind of the holy grail of democracy, right? So the biggest problem democracy has, and I say this as a person who studies countries that very clearly did not have democracy and all of a sudden got it, is that it doesn't quite fulfill its promise, right? So you fight and fight for democracy, and you get there, and all of a sudden it just doesn't fulfill your promise. Your sort of day-to-day life is just not working, right? Like it just doesn't work. And so I think there is a part of it that is just the nature of democracy, right? Like representation is just very tricky business because government represents a bunch of people with different interests, some of them opposed to each other, right? So representation in of itself is a very tricky business. But I also think that representation has declined for a couple of reasons. One is this country, and I would argue other countries, do not have one person, one vote, is $1, one vote, right? And so people who has money has more access to representatives, has the ability to influence decisions in ways that sort of your regular citizen does not. But the second reason that I think institutions are failing is because we have taken them for granted as citizens, right? Like, so we don't stand up for them. We don't go and stand up. Like the most unpopular thing that I ever say is go on and stand up for your congressman or congresswoman, because they're like, no, they're terrible. All politicians are bad. This is horrible. And I say, no, some politicians are bad. Some politicians are good. Like, you know. And the other thing is, I think leadership at the national and subnational level has pretty much taken laws and regulations that were designed to protect minorities in the legislative body, or that were designed to make the legislative process more faster or create stronger courts, and used and weaponized them against their opponents. And I think that that's the other thing that needs to stop. We need to leadership needs to stop using institutions as their punching ball, as the mechanism they use to attack others. And we citizens needs to stand with those leaders who stand up against that, even if we don't agree with those leaders in other things. I hope that answers the question.
I hate to beat a dead horse, but you do not seem like the glass half full kind of person after that. Oh my goodness. Thank you, Comfort, for that question. The next on my list is Martin. Go ahead, Martin.
Thank you, Aaron. My question is for Professor Daniels. We all know that youth turnout is among the lowest in the United States for voting. I believe this could be due to the mentality that adults have had towards them when they were younger. I know personally in my experience, I was told sometimes that I was too young to understand politics, that I didn't have an opinion that mattered because I didn't have a vote, et cetera, et cetera. And I would like to ask you this. Would you support lowering the minimum voting age to better encourage young voters who are the future of the country to vote when they previously have felt that they've been silenced?
That's a great question. I think I'm going to start by certainly in this last election, this last presidential election, we had high youth turnout. And I do think that it's changing, right? I think that certainly when we saw after the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, we saw young people out and mobilized, right? And I think we have to talk about how to change, how to move from protest to power. And so when I have an 18-year-old, and so when I talk to her about issues that she cares about, it's like, oh, you're concerned about climate change. Guess what? This person has the power to make decisions about whether or not you have electric cars or whether or not solar is something that's encouraged, right? So solar energy is encouraged. So I try to point out to certain young people in particular the power that the vote has, the power that registering to vote has, the power to actually voting has. And I think that we should. I don't know if I have an opinion about lowering the voting age to 16, but I think because I think there are things that we can do now to encourage and educate certainly more young people to actually get out and cast a ballot. Certainly one of the things that we can do is making registration more automatic. Just as young men have to sign up for the selective service, why not distribute and have folk fill out voter registration applications at the same time, or have the entire graduating class. I think you should, along with your diplomas, you should get voter registration cards at the same time, right? And so that we can encourage students and encourage young people to not only get that voter registration card, but understand the power that the vote has. I say to young people often that if there was no power in the vote, then why are people fighting so hard to make sure that you don't get to exercise it? So I think certainly there are things we can do to increase participation on all levels.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. The final question from the Suffolk University students is from Grace Fall. I will just say that we are just under 15 minutes from the end, and we do want to get a few more questions in from the audience. So, sorry, go ahead, Grace.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to all of the panelists for being here. My question is for Congressman Clyburn. It is widely believed that your endorsement of then candidate Biden was pivotal in him becoming the Democratic nominee. Protecting voting rights is at the top of the president's agenda. In August of 2021, when asked about the voter rights bill, you stated, quote, "I personally feel that we are doing what can be done to fulfill the promise made to the African-American community. All of these things are demonstrating that the president is running an inclusive administration," end quote. My question for you is, since the efforts of the For the People Act and John Lewis Voting Rights Act have stalled, do you still personally feel this way? And is the president doing everything in his power to protect the rights of the voters that supported him?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Yes, I still feel that way. And the president is doing everything that's within his power. The president can propose. The Congress disposes. We've passed the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We passed For the People Act. In fact, I think we passed John R. Lewis twice. And it's lingering over there in the Senate. Now, the fact of the matter is the Senate holds on to some archaic rules like the filibuster, which ain't in the Constitution. It's just a tradition. And there are at least 52 people, 50 Republicans and 2 Democrats, who feel that it's more important to maintain the traditions of the Senate than it is to guarantee voting rights to all of our citizens. And that's where we're off, 52 to 48. And so the president was a senator at one time, but he doesn't have a vote in the Senate now. And one of those Democrats who seem to feel that the tradition should prevail. President Biden lost his state by 40% vote, 40%. So I think that that's where we are. And that's not new. Strom Thurmond from my state broke the filibuster in 1957. He set the record in 1957, filibustering what was just a policy, wasn't even a law. And so, as I said earlier, anything that's happened before can happen again. And history is repeating itself. And the question still remains, will we have an intervention by voters to prevent this from taking hold? If the elections come November, if those elections come out in favor of this autocratic movement, democracy will be lost.
So that actually is a good segue into a question from Vlas. If nothing changes in the US political sphere, it sounds like you are saying, this is his question, could we get radical or populist politicians coming into power?
Absolutely, I'm saying that. And remember I said earlier about these Supreme Court decisions. Now, I mentioned Shelby v. Holder. That was a voting rights decision. Remember, Citizens United in 2010 established corporations as people.
People, yeah.
You know, if corporations are people, that means the people who make up the corporation got a vote. Then collectively, as a corporation, they got another vote. What does that mean? It's not one
math.
person, one vote here. So we're doing things that violate every principle that we have established as a country. And that's just one, those are two decisions, Supreme Court decisions that I've mentioned. And the one that's about to come, dealing with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, because that's what the Supreme Court is doing. They're saying, okay, we know you three judges down there say it's unfair, but we're gonna let the election go forward anyway while we litigate this issue and make our decision later. By the time they make their decision, the elections will be held.
Yeah.
They'll be over. And it means to me, they don't intend to decide it's unconstitutional. They decide to get rid, they have already decided they're going to get rid of the rest of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
We have a question here from Matthias. I hope I pronounced that correctly. This is for Jared. And it's kind of a localizing of what you do. An ominous flag was draped down from an overpass in Boston last week, and it read, "White patience has limits." It was unclear what exactly the message was, what the message was being sent. With your work examining right-wing movements, what do you think can be done to resist white supremacist messaging? And do we know what that meant?
Yeah, I know exactly what happened there. That was a group called Nationalist Socialist Club 131. It's a neo-Nazi organization that advocates violence. And they were participating in a wave of protests that's been happening every month for about the last year called White Lives Matter. It has attracted white supremacist, neo-Nazi groups out into the open for demonstrations once a month on a rolling basis. So the banner that was in Boston was part of that. That was the local demonstration of part of that sort of decentralized protest movement. As far as opposing these groups, I mentioned earlier that the people, these anti-democratic movements in the US represent a minority of population. White supremacist movements represent, at least like swastika bearing, white supremacist type of movements represent an even smaller minority of the population. And most people, normal people, are kind of instinctively repulsed by them. So, part of what I do with my research and part of what a lot of reporters on this beat do is just seek to expose these groups and report out information that, is revealing about them. And ultimately, to drive this stuff back into the corners, there has to be a social cost to doing this. And I do worry sort of generally if people are becoming complacent with politics, as all of these things we've been talking about tonight are going on, that social cost isn't really being demonstrated in society. White supremacists should be afraid to show their face in public. They shouldn't be so out and proud that they're throwing banners over the highway. And part of that is just kind of finding solidarity with each other and putting our foot down and saying that it's not who we are and that those people should be ashamed.
This is kind of a question, I think, for all of you from Daniela. The GOP recently declared their official stance that the events of January 6th were legitimate political discourse. This is one of the two major parties in the United States declaring what we all saw to be legitimate political discourse. How do you fight back against that? I mean, Professor Gamboa, let's start with you.
So I study opposition strategies against the erosion of democracy. And what I have found out in my research based on Latin America is that opposition strategies that rely mostly on sort of what I call institutional moderate, that is Congress, legislation, litigation, these kind of tools, alongside with street demonstrations that are well organized, well structured, not like we just got together through Facebook, but rather like we got training. We're not gonna give up to instigators and stuff like that. Those are the ways in which you can fight these things back. And the way you fight them back is a little bit on the margins, right? It's really hard. Like it's very tempting to respond fire with fire, right? It's very tempting to say, well, they are completely undemocratic in their claims, which they are. So we are going to turn equally undemocratic because that's the only way to fight back. And I disagree with that. And my research disagrees with that. Most importantly, what we need to do is to stand up, is push for legislative, even if it's in the margins, even if the legislation does not pass, having a bill that tries to protect voting in Congress is important. Having litigation going on in the courts is important, even if the courts do not approve it. Having people mobilizing on the streets peacefully, and by peacefully I mean not only we intend to be peaceful, but actually we resisted any instigation, is important, because it kind of makes it reduce the ability of these other groups to leverage any misstep to advance their agenda. They cannot say, well, Democrats are also violent, or Democrats are also undemocratic. Democrats are also, they can't. If those who support democracy do not give up the high ground, the other ones cannot take it. And so that's what I have found, and that's what we see sort of in my research in Colombia and Venezuela.
And Professor Daniels, I imagine your answer to the question is vote them out, right? But given what you've told us, that's, first of all, that's not so easy. Second of all, there is the question of apathy. Someone asked the question about young people not voting. One of our students. What do we do?
Well, I think it's what Laura said. Essentially, it takes operating on all fronts, right? We have to have folk litigating cases. We got to have folk in the legislature, certainly like Representative Clyburn and others. And we have to have folk in these streets, certainly mobilizing, and we also have to do. Everyone has to do their part, right? So we have to be aware of what's going on, educating ourselves. We have to unsilo in many places, right? Because we only listen to news that we agree with, right? And so we have to make sure that we're certainly aware of what's going on, and that we're reaching out. In the NAACP, they used to say, each one teach one, or each one reach one. And so, all these campaigns to bring people to the polls and to make sure that, everyone is registered in your family and your friends and those kinds of things. I think it's going to take all of those things. And I think those things do lead you to the vote. I think I told you earlier, I'm from a family of overcomers, right? And so I have to have a glass half full mentality, because certainly we have more tools than we have more education than we've ever had, and so we as a people, right? And so it certainly means that we have to use all of these things to make sure that we certainly can overcome instead of being overcome. So we have to put in the work, because what we've been talking about tonight is it definitely takes work to maintain a democracy, and we all have to do the work.
Congressman Clyburn, I'm getting the sort of proverbial hook here, the Zoom hook, to wrap this up. But I have to ask you, because I've been dying to know. I've had a lot of discussions with friends about, whether you talk to them, do you even bother, right? Because the gulf seems so wide in these the view of things, that it's just impossible to talk to someone who believes the way that they, whoever they are, do. You have to do that every day. You're in a building every day with people who want to tell us that what we saw did not happen, or did not happen the way we saw it, or think we saw it. How do you, I don't know if get along is the right word, but do you have conversations with people? It's not even across the aisle anymore. It's across the chasm.
Sure, I do. Almost every day. I don't believe that I should judge the entire Republican Party by what I see a few of them do, any more than I want the public to judge the entire Democratic Party by two people who are refusing to allow the filibuster to end. We got 50 Democrats in the Senate. Two of them are opposing, and everybody says the Democrats aren't doing it. Don't judge all Democrats by those two. And so by the same token, I'm not going to judge all Republicans by the few who seem not to want to see this democracy continue its pursuit of perfection. That's what the preamble is all about. In pursuit of a more perfect union. And so these things deserve our attention. These people deserve reaching out to, and I do it every day. I've got legislation now I just proposed with Harold Rogers, who's a Republican from Kentucky. It would be called 10, 20, 30, directing at least 10% of all the money in those communities where 20% or more of the population's been stuck beneath the poverty level for the last 30 years. That's what the Census Bureau says is a persistent poverty county. On the Senate side, Cory Booker is proposing that legislation along with Bob Portman from Ohio. So yes, we reach out to each other. Hopefully, these kind of activities will ultimately prevail. Just remember, we've been here before, many times before. And I want to say before we close, the Ku Klux Klan was first organized by a former Confederate general. So Nathan Bedford Forrest, now he says he was not the founder, but he was the first big official in it. And all the people he recruited were former military people. So hate groups got a long history of being grounded in militaristic terms.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Professor Daniels, Professor Gamboa, and Jared. Thank you all for joining us. And thanks for everyone in the audience who asked questions as well. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. There were several 4 dozen questions. Thank you for participating. It has been a pleasure to talk with the 4 of you. Let me just give the microphone back to Christina for a moment for goodbyes.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I definitely want to echo what Aaron has said in terms of thanking you all for a fabulous conversation. My glass is quite literally more than half empty at this point. It's probably time for everybody to get some dinner.
Mine is too, by the way.
I want to express again our gratitude for your time, for your insights, and for your attempt to make us all think about glasses half full. To our audience, thank you. To our students who came on, great questions. You made me proud. And I would like to invite everybody to come to the next episode, which will air on March 1st. The topic will continue today's discussion, and we're going to take a deeper dive into the question of partisanship or hyperpartisanship. We'll have two former members of Congress, a Democrat and a Republican, plus another scholar of democratic erosion, and our students joining us as well. So go have some dinner, and thank you all so much. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Christina.
Good night.